11:01 here. It's 11:01 over there. Welcome everyone to today's Ethnic Media Services. This is our weekly national news briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero. I'm the associate editor for Ethnic Media Services and your moderator for today. With the presidential elections just 3 weeks away and early voting already underway or about to begin in most states, it's crucial to have accurate and thorough information to ensure our voices count. While some experts are sounding the alarm on threats to election sites and officials and the safety of the ballots, others are working around the clock to ensure communities' access. This briefing brings together top national and local election experts who will discuss ensuring all eligible voters are registered and able to vote. We'll share a roundup of new state voting laws that could facilitate or hinder participation, and we'll delve into some of the most significant threats to conducting safe and secure elections. We have a distinguished panel of speakers today. They are Celina Stewart. She's the CEO of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Andrew Garber, Counsel of Voting Rights and Election Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Robert A. Pate, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. And May Tiwamankala, Advocacy Director at Arizona Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander for Equity. We will send the video of today's briefing along with expanded bios for each speaker later today. We will also send video excerpts of the presentations early next week. Reporters, please remember you enter your questions in the chat box. We will have a 4-minute Q&A immediately after each speaker presents. I made the Q&A a little shorter so we can have more time at the end. So take advantage of that time. So we go right to the panel. We are honored to have Celina Stewart. She's the CEO of a very well-respected and historic organization in the U.S., the League of Women Voters. Welcome, Ms. Stewart. We're honored to have you.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. So thank you, Pilar. Let me know if I can just get started.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so okay, thanks for this invitation. So I want to talk a little bit about the categories that Pilar just mentioned. So the importance of voting. So first, obviously voting is important for so many reasons. Voting empowers better representation. It's also an important civic duty, of course, in the United States and globally. And it's just a really powerful way to express our opinions about the world and who represents us in government. And so the leaders that we elect make decisions that affect our daily lives. Elections are also our chance to stand up for what matters most to us. We've seen that a lot in the US election with some very personal issues coming up for voters, and to have an impact on the issues that affect us, our communities and families, and our future. Elections, especially the local elections, really are the elections that impact like our day-to-day, like how we actually engage in the world, whether that's healthcare and jobs, or whether it's climate change. We saw just a couple of weeks ago the impact of the hurricanes in the South in the United States, and that impacts elections directly, and it impacts our work directly as well. And so when we choose our leaders by voting, we're really choosing the people who will make decisions in moments like that, and especially as things take shape in the direction of the country and our communities. And so for me, the reason why I vote is really because voting has never just been about the individual in my family or in my community. It has always been about voting on behalf of. And so when I say that, it's always voting on behalf of the folks in my family who are not enfranchised to vote for whatever reason that may be, but also just to ensure that my nieces and nephews, people coming after me, that I'm voting in ways that actually protect their own futures as well. And so for me, voting is such a personal thing. But again, it's not just about me. So it's personal and community all at once. So we have a few tools that we leverage at the League to help voters specifically. And so one of those things is Vote for 11. The vote411.org is really our one-stop shop. It's an election resource that millions of voters use each election cycle. That includes, and now there's actually a new tool that we launched. It's a campaign finance tool, and it has campaign finance information so that people have more understanding, can see more transparency around who's funding certain candidates and the election. So this innovative feature provides voters with insights into the financial backers of federal candidates. Particularly, we thought that was important for the 2024 election with so many comments and commentary about the 2022 or the 2020 elections and potential interference overseas. So some of the notable quotes on why campaign finance feature is important is the league's mission is really to ensure that voters have all the information they need to vote with confidence. And some of that confidence comes from knowing what's on your ballot, what the individual candidates around or align around. And then transparency around campaign finance is really essential to our nonpartisan voter information because it helps voters to learn more about the candidates and choose who best represents them in their interests. It's also just really important. People often have questions about donations and wanting more transparency around campaign donations. And we think that's critical for voters to understand who's influencing and shaping potentially a candidate's policies and how they're showing up. So when voters can see who's donating to federal candidates, it really empowers them to make informed decisions as they learn more about the candidates seeking to represent. And then there's some other league work I also just want to mention since I've got 8 minutes, not 8 more minutes, 8 minutes total. And that is candidate forums. Around this time, yes, and Kayla Bix is my comm source and she is fact checking me in the chat. So Vote for One comes in English and Spanish. So for those Spanish speaking demographics, that is also available. For our candidate forums in particular, so this is the season where leagues are holding hundreds of candidate forums I would say weekly around their communities. It's vital that voters have the opportunity to hear directly from candidates. We do voter guides, and that's a printed resource for folks, but nothing is better than being able to show up and hear directly from a candidate and to ask your questions. And so this is particularly vital in local races where there may be more modest budgets and limited media attention. Sometimes the media attention goes mostly to the larger offices and the larger scope of offices. And so these debates and forums create a really unique space for open dialogue and conversation, and it's tailored to the needs of that particular community and the issues that they care about. We also have the Democracy Truth Project. The Democracy Truth Project is part of the Women Powered Democracy campaign that we have here at the League. And it aims to strengthen democracy and restore trust in the electoral process by combating mis and disinformation. We have seen mis and disinformation on the rise in the last several election cycles. We saw it on Facebook in 2020. We saw it show up again in the midterms in 2022, and it has not gone away. So it continues into the 2024 election as something that we have dedicated staff watching. So the project this project in particular, it leverages the extensive expertise that league leaders and partners provide to the public with information and tools to participate in our democracy and restore trust in the political system. So we are watching for mis and disinformation online. We are also have a toolkit and we have a protocol for how leagues engage when they see information like that. Our role is to put out accurate information to make sure people have, a counter narrative to mis and disinformation that could be out there. And I'll just close with what voters can do. So I know that there's a lot of press outlets on the call, and so oftentimes one of the hooks is sharing what voters can do during a time like this with so much information coming around. And so first and foremost, register to vote, but more importantly, update and check your registration. We have seen in not only this election cycle, but election cycles in the past that there are often purges that happen or removing voters from rolls. And everyone wants clean rolls. That's not something that we dispute, but it has to be done in a legal way. And there are rules for how that can be done. The National Voter Registration Act is one example of that. But if you move or you change your name, it's important to just make sure that you are still on the rolls and that you're not in a state where if you don't register by a certain time, you cannot vote because there's no way to cure that or fix it in some states. Learning about early and mail-in voting opportunities in your state. This week alone, so many states, I think it was like a dozen states who had early voting that started. We saw in Georgia there were 300,000 people who showed up on Tuesday, on the first day, which was like insane. I was also talking to some of our local league members in North Carolina, and in past times they could vote within maybe 10 or 15 minutes. They're waiting in line for more than an hour to vote. And it's not because things are slow, it's because there's so many more people turning out during the early voting part of this election cycle. And if you're eligible to vote by mail in your state, you can request a ballot. I live in Maryland. I requested my ballot, and you can turn it in at any location in the state during the early voting period. And so the other thing that people can do, last but not least, is check Vote 411 to find your polling locations. Sometimes on election day, polling locations change or they close. Obviously, with the hurricane, we have seen a lot of changes happening because some locations just are no longer level. They have been caught up in the hurricane. And so checking Vote 411 will provide up-to-date information in terms of where you can vote, where your polling location may have moved, how to get your ballot if you have moved or if your house is not in a position to accept mail, and all of those things. So I hope that that is helpful for people just to know what they can do. And always, you can check lwv.org. We have a ton of information on our website to help, but also just plugging into those local entities is certainly an option.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Stewart. One question, what is your biggest concern right now about the security of the elections this year from your observations?
Yeah, so the US has some of the most secure elections in the world, right? And so there's so many checks and balances that come with that. I think that there are external factors which cause some issues like the hurricane. Obviously, like what we were most concerned with was whether or not machines were going to be damaged that are usually calculating and counting ballots and such. But I think that we still have a very secure election. We are not concerned about the actual infrastructure apparatus. It's more about people's availability and access to. And so, but beyond that, we always are concerned about things, voters being purged. We're concerned about polling locations changing last minute, people not knowing where to go. So we're trying to be a fill that gap in terms of
Mm.
providing that information to voters.
We have a question from Henrietta Burrows. Go ahead, Henrietta.
Thanks, Celina. I'm sorry. Thanks, Pilar. Um,
Hi.
yes. How is your organization financed, and what are the main challenges that the organization faces?
So we have a mix of money that we receive to support our work. So we have individual donors, which is our biggest bucket of money. And then we do work with, we are funded by some foundations around the country, like the Jerome Green, the Spitzer Foundation, and places like that have also funded us. But the great thing about the league is that there are so many of us that many of us invest back in the league to do our work. So I would say it's a combination of individual donors, major donors, and foundation support.
And the
Okay,
main challenges?
Yeah, I would say one of the challenges, and this may be true of any nonprofit, is you want to get money in on one side of the house because you have a little bit more flexibility in using it. So we actually get most of our funding on the C3 side, which is our education side, and the political side is a smaller bucket of money, which is, I think, very common for a lot of organizations similar to us. But I think, the challenge is, having enough. One of the things that we are doing is we are working to build state capacity in states across the country. And so it takes money to do that, right? And depending on what we're trying to do. But as we attract more volunteers to do this work, we recognize that there's an opportunity for paid staff and to be in every state to help move this work along. So that's part of our transformation work that we're doing right now. So that is a challenge, but one that we are certainly up to the challenge and trying to raise money for.
And
Thank you.
I was really excited that you were coming to the briefing because I've heard of the league for many, many years, and I know you are in every state. You have state chapters, local chapters, and you do all
Yeah.
this work. You have all these voter guides. It's really a resource to people. And if you go to vote411.org, You have all kinds of information, how to register, how to check your registration, how to find out what's on your ballot, personalized voting information, information by state, and nationwide voting rules, etc. I mean, it's really complete. So I invite everyone to share this with their readership, with your audience. This is a nonpartisan source, and it's a really helpful thing to have, and you can access your local chapter as well. Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Can you stay around for a little bit with
Yes, and
us?
Pilar, it's a shame that you already have a job because you were just a walking promotion board for us. So I would like steal you in a heartbeat. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an honor to have you. All right, let's move on to our second panelist, Andrew Garber, who will discuss state election laws and some big changes that have happened recently. Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Pilar, and again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. So the Brennan Center puts out a few times a year our voting laws roundup, where we track every voting related bill in all 50 legislatures across the country to get a scope of how voting laws are changing. And when I talk about this, I'm going to tell you a lot of numbers. There's going to be some big generalities, and I think that's important so you can have a sense of the scope of change, the kinds of change going on. But it's really great to be on a panel like this where you can hear about how those changes are actually impacting voters and an individual.
Andrew, just remember to speak slowly for the interpreters.
Sure. Apologies.
Thank you.
It's really great to understand how those changes are impacting individual voters and individual communities, because at the end of the day, that's what matters most, not how we categorize one state or another. Anyway, diving in over the last 4 years, we've seen an unprecedented rate of voting-related bills being introduced and passed throughout the country. In this last election cycle, at least 30 states have passed 78 restrictive voting laws, which are laws that make it harder to vote in one way or another. To give you a sense of comparison, from 2016 to 2020, we saw 27 such laws. And from 2013 to 2016, we saw 17 of those restrictive laws, meaning in the past 4 years, we've almost doubled what we had in the prior 8 years in terms of voting restrictions. By far, the most common type of voting restriction we've seen put into place relates to mail voting. Sure, everyone remembers in 2020, there was an explosion of people voting by mail, either for the first time or much higher rates than before as a result of the pandemic. And a big theme coming out of that is states now making it harder to vote. In a lot of cases, this has particularly fallen on communities of color. Just to give you one example, in Georgia, before 2020, Georgia has had no excuse mail voting for a couple decades, so everyone who wants to vote by mail is able to. Before 2020, it was white voters who primarily took advantage of voting by mail. In 2020, that flipped. The rate of voters of color using mail voting went way up relative to white voters. The Georgia legislature reconvenes in January in 2021, and what is one of its top priorities? It passes a law that makes it harder to vote in a lot of different ways, but particularly goes after mail voting. And I think that law is really useful to understand how these restrictions work because of the way it targets mail voting. A lot of voting restrictions aren't states putting up giant signs that say you can't vote. There used to be a lot more overt voter suppression in prior generations, but states today are a little bit craftier, but no less pernicious in trying to stop people from voting. What these do is they're kind of death by 1,000 cuts. They add a speed bump here and a hurdle there, and now what you've done is you've made it just a little too hard for some people to get to the ballot box. Celina mentioned long lines, and I think that's a good example of how a state can put in place a series of events that ends up making it harder to vote. You shorten the window to request a mail ballot, and you make it a little harder for people who need assistance to get that assistance voting a mail ballot. You close some early voting sites. You have a little bit less staff at the polling place. Now more people have to go in person on election day. More people need to ask election workers for help they weren't able to get elsewhere. That can lead to longer lines, and that particularly falls on low-income voters. It falls on voters with disabilities, older voters, people who have things like family care responsibilities, who have trouble getting to a polling place that might be a little farther than it used to. They get there, they see a long line, they think, I can't wait. These are the ways these voting restrictions really pile up, and they create a vicious cycle that can prevent some people from voting. And I think it's worth mentioning as well, mail balloting is certainly not the only type of voting restriction we've seen go into effect. We've seen attacks on the entire voting process. We're seeing laws that make it harder to register to vote. We're seeing laws that make it harder for organizations to help people register to vote, making get out the vote drives, for example, more challenging. We're seeing all sorts of shortened deadlines. We're seeing restrictions on the ability of election officials to implement policies that are helpful at a local level, states basically tying the hands of your local election administrators. And of course, we're seeing attacks on end-day polling places as well as mail voting. Also worth mentioning, while 2021 was the crest of this wave, it hasn't slowed down. 2024 had the second most restrictive voting laws passed of any year since we've been tracking this going back over a decade. So the numbers are really something we hadn't been seeing previously. However, there is very much a good side to this story, which is that while a lot of states are making it harder to vote, more states are making it easier to vote. They are looking around and saying, what is working for people in other states and how can we incorporate that here? Over the last 4 years, at least 41 states have passed 168 laws to make it easier to vote. That's wonderful. That's a lot of new laws. And again, these new laws help at all stages of the voting process. Things like automatic voter registration are now in effect in more states, meaning if you interact with the government agency and you provide the information they need to register you to vote or update your voter registration, that happens automatically. You don't have to fill out a separate form. That can be really helpful. Again, thinking, Celina mentioned some people might not think about checking if they're registered until it's too late. Well, maybe they went to the DMV a few months ago and that was taken care of for them. That can be a huge lift to voters. A lot of states, too, are making it easier to vote by mail. I live in New York. Up until the last couple of years, you had to have an excuse to vote by mail. So you needed to be out of town on election day or be ill. In some states, voters over 65 are allowed to. Now, New York, like many other states, like Georgia, lets everyone who wants to vote by mail do so just as a matter of choice. New York and Michigan are two states that I would say passed a lot of new voting laws. But we've also seen some states that, although the numbers aren't as high, they have passed laws that are really helpful to certain communities within their state. New Mexico and Nevada come to mind as states that have passed laws in the last couple of years to help make sure that Native American voters are able to access the ballot. In a lot of places, Native voters might face unique challenges, whether they live on reservations or otherwise. And so some states are taking steps to make sure that those people can be fully ingrained in our democracy and don't face extra challenges when it comes to voting. The last thing I say before I'm excited to hear any questions just relates to not relying solely on the numbers. So often the story is about is the story of what the laws do. And just to give you an example is Texas. In the last 4 years, the state of Texas has passed 3 laws that we categorize as expansive and 4 laws that we categorize as restrictive. If that's all you knew, you might say, okay, well, maybe things in Texas are more or less the same. But in reality, that's not the case. It is harder to vote in Texas than it was 4 years ago. And a big part of that is because of a law known as SB 1, which is just chock full of things that make it harder to vote. They do a lot of the things I talked about. They make it harder to get a mail ballot. They tie the hands of local election officials. They make it harder for people who need assistance in casting a ballot to get that assistance. And so there's no question that it comes down to a little more than the numbers. And so as great as it is to see so many states passing expansive laws, unfortunately, so many states are going the other way. And just, as a last reminder to people, message to give to voters as we approach this election to check their registration. Think about making a plan to vote. Do I want to vote by mail? What are my options? What are my deadlines? If I want to vote early in person, when and where? If I want to vote in person on election day, do I know where my polling place is and have a plan to get to the polls? Because for so many people, it might be different than what they experienced 4 or even 2 years ago. That's going to be great for millions of Americans, but it might pose new challenges for millions of Americans in other states.
Thank you, Andrew. I can see how a legislator will say, oh, let's make it easier for people to vote. That makes a lot of sense. But what are the excuses given for making it more difficult? It's kind of hard to understand.
I agree that it's hard for me to understand why legislators want to make it hard for people to vote. One refrain we've seen over and over are claims that our elections have widespread fraud and we need to fix that. That's untrue. Over and over and over, we see that our elections are safe and secure. We're able to account for all the ballots cast. We understand what's going on. Election officials throughout the country are doing really great work, really doing community service in running our elections, really helping out. But unfortunately, that has not stopped some leaders from spreading disinformation, from making these false claims. And in fact, some of our Brennan Center research has shown that it was pretty common that there's a strong correlation, I should say, between state legislators who, following the 2020 election, spread these claims, these false claims about voter fraud, being the same legislators who in 2021 introduced these restrictive voting bills. So there's this clear nexus between, on the one hand, believing or promoting false claims about our elections, and on the other hand, implementing laws that make it harder for people to vote. That remains a major concern, and it's one of the many reasons it's important that we all, as citizens, have a clear understanding of how our elections work and what the truth is.
Okay, there's an interesting question here by Renee about voting online. Renee, you want to ask your question?
Sure. 1 year I was able to vote online, and ever since that's no longer an option. Do you know why?
So I am surprised to hear that you were able to vote online 1 year. Online voting is something that, to my knowledge, and perhaps many of my panelists know more, co-panelists know more, I invite them to pitch in. To my knowledge, online voting is something that is virtually non-existent in our system. I think there is widespread acceptance among election security experts that the technology is not there. We can't do it as reliably as we do other methods of voting. If you were able to for one reason or another, as long as you're able to cast your ballot, that's always the most important thing. But I don't believe that's an option for really any voters in our system. And so I guess just as a general message, because this is something we see, unfortunately, every election year, is false claims about if you text this number, it'll count as your ballot. Those are untrue. People should go on their either state or local county websites, a .gov address, to make sure they are getting information directly from election officials, and they aren't being misled on the best way to cast their ballot.
Andrew, I have Raymond Tyler has a question, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Raymond Tyler.
Mute. Trying to unmute.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Good.
I see every day where they're already planning fraudulent contest of election results. Are there any plans being made to combat that? I find it frustrating that people are saying every day, we're gonna cause an uprising. We're not going to accept the results. And people are basically saying, okay, so are there any plans being actually formulated to combat that?
Yes, thank you for your question, Raymond, and thank you, Renee, and everyone else who asked questions as well. There are a lot of plans in place from a lot of different groups and organizations. It's very common after elections that litigation takes place, largely among the candidates and political parties. This isn't a bad thing by itself. One, our court system exists to adjudicate disputes, and they're well set up to hear evidence. The system worked very well in 2020. The Trump campaign brought 60-something lawsuits, I believe, and I think all but one of them ended up failing in court. And over it was the same refrain of courts demanding evidence and them not being able to provide evidence to support their claims. So we have very robust structures in place to make sure the systems work. One very quick other point I'll make, and then I'll stop, is around election certification. Election certification is what's known as a ministerial task. It means local and state election officials have to do it as a matter of course. They don't have discretion. Certification is not the point in the process where we recount the ballots. There are what's known as canvassing and reconciliation, where election officials make sure the numbers add up. Parties can bring lawsuits, as I just said. There are audits and recounts. There have been efforts to lay the groundwork for election officials to not certify this false election, which is an effort that would result in chaos. The Georgia State Election Board passed a rule a month or so ago saying local election officials don't have to certify. I think it was just earlier this week. It's been a long week. A court in Georgia said that's wrong. Election officials must certify the election. So that's one example of a place where our existing structures are currently holding up against efforts to undermine them. We have the legal safeguards in place. It's important they function the way they're supposed to.
Andrew, thank you so much. Please stay around for a little bit so we can have more questions at the end. Let's go now to Professor Robert Pape, who has been tracking the issue of safety of the elections, particularly of election workers. Professor, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be part of this important panel. But I'm also sorry that, well, voting is a happy topic. The topic I'm going to be talking about is not so happy. It's going to be about political violence related to the election. And I know before you come in that you've all been reading about rising threats to election workers as November nears. And this has been going on for months. It's actually heating up a bit. And what I want to do is I want to help you put some of this in context so you know how seriously to take this. I'm going to first tell you a little bit more about myself. Then I'm going to put this in the context of the recent historic escalation of threats and assassination attempts. Then I'm going to talk about the specific dangers on election day. And then I'm going to say, what can we do? And I'm going to focus on governors and swing states. I am a scholar who's been studying political violence for over 30 years. Most of that time has been focusing overseas. In the last few years, I've been focusing on American political violence because I believe that's the greatest danger to our democracy. I have done recent pieces. If you want to know more about my work, you can go to the New York Times op-ed I did last week, or a couple weeks before that, I did a 5,000-word piece in Foreign Affairs. So this will give you the larger landscape of my research and my thinking about what's happening in our country. But the first thing I want to do is I want to call your attention to the historic rise of acts of political violence. And the first place I want to start is with since I'm speaking to ethnic media, is I want to talk about ethnic attacks, because you may think of these as only ethnic or racial attacks. But in fact, many of you are going to know there's the Tree of Life shooting in 2018, the El Paso shooting in 2019, the Buffalo shooting in 2022. And it's important to know that although these are going against three different ethnic groups, these are all politically motivated. They are all manifestations of the far right-wing conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement. They were all motivated by shooters trying to stop the replacement of the white population in the country by other ethnic groups. And the shooters wrote detailed manifestos to this point. Very important to see that sometimes what we call racial or ethnic is actually politically motivated. And that's especially important to call attention to now. Now, just in the last 2 years, we've seen an assassination attempt against Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, missed her, almost killed her husband. We also saw an assailant surveilling, trying to get into former President Barack Obama's house in Washington, D.C., and he had guns and other explosives in his van as he was trying to do that. And I'm sure you all know the most recent, which are the 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump. Now, what you might not know is that there have been also rising threats to members of Congress and to both parties. At my center at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, we undertook a special project to go back to 2001, over 20 years, to study every prosecuted threat to a member of Congress. And what did we find? We found that on an annual basis, those prosecuted threats by the Department of Justice spiked up 5-fold on an annual basis, starting with the first year of the Trump presidency, and has stayed high with every year since, including under the Biden presidency. Now, just to show you the last couple of years, and you can see the long list of both Republican leaders and Democratic leaders here who have had threats that were so serious the assailants were prosecuted. This is going on in a very serious way. And most of this revolves around support or lack of support for Donald Trump or criticism of Donald Trump. So we are in an election now where that is at the heart of things. And we need to see that all the context of this election official threats that you are seeing is happening in essentially a hotbed of political violence that you would have to go back to the 1960s or 70s to see anything like this degree of. So it's not quite completely unprecedented, but it is historically, we are at a historically high period. Now, I want to also emphasize something about how we know and how we track political violence as experts in political violence. Because the big thing that experts know that non-experts don't is that mass support, public support for political violence is the key to political violence. The more the public supports political violence, it's not that everybody in the public does political violence, is that this gives a mantle of legitimacy, nudging would-be attackers who may be volatile for their own reasons to act out. And that makes political violence much more likely and more dangerous. In other words, when there's significant degrees of public support for political violence, volatile individuals who can be nudged and believe their acts will be popular. And we see this again and again and again, because those assailants and all of those attacks that I just laid out for you, they either were making manifestos to become popular, planning to live stream their attacks. They are counting on the publicity of their attacks, and that's because they believe they have an audience wanting those attacks. Now, that's why we at my center at the University of Chicago have been tracking public support for political violence going back to summer of 2021, and we do this every 3 months in a quarterly survey. Our most recent survey was done just September 16th, and it has an impressive margin of error, under 3%. And these are super expensive, high quality, and I'm glad to discuss them if you want to know more about it, how we do them. But the bottom line is that we are seeing significant support for political violence related to Trump, either for Trump or against Trump, in the body politic. 6% on one side, 8% on the other. That is a lot of people, folks. That's a lot of people. Now, what does this mean? Let's focus on support for Trump, because after all, Trump has been egging this on. Well, what this means is we have 15 million people already supporting violence for Trump, but we have another 42 ambivalent who might be nudged in that direction if their side loses. So this, if Trump loses, could actually get worse. We also know, because we asked them in the surveys, that they have a lot of capability. We'll notice a third of them already own guns. So guns are easy to get. This group already owns them. And notice they also have relations with militia groups. Now, another thing we do is we ask questions about their other attitudes. And the group, we ask, do you agree, disagree that the Democratic Party is deliberately replacing the white electorate with new, more obedient voters from the third world? That is the great replacement idea. And the more people believe in that great replacement, the 7 times more likely they are to support violence for Trump. We also ask about what's called race resentment. Do you resent African Americans for getting affirmative action? And the more you agree with this, you are 3 times more almost 4 times more likely to support force to restore Trump to the presidency. This is not good for minorities, as you could imagine. That's why I'm bringing this up. Now, election officials are likely to be an inevitable focal point as we go forward, because we now all know after January 6th that the counting and certification of these votes absolutely critical. And election day itself is a danger point, but it actually gets worse after that point because of the schedule of how that counting and certification happens at the state levels. And in particular, ballot tabulation centers. Well, remember in 2020, we watched on TV as Philadelphia was counting. Well, if that happens again, it's important to know bad guys will know about this too. And initial losers here, especially I would worry about it on the Trump side, initial losers might see this as a strategic target, as a way to not lose. And the goal here wouldn't just be to create violence for its own sake. It could be to simply destroy the ballots, literally physically destroy the ballots. And that's a problem because we could have very close elections in, say, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, where the destruction of even, say, 3 or 5% of those ballots would really throw this into chaos for real. Because how would you determine who won if we're in that close of an election again? Now, there's good news, which is that we also find that the vast majority of the public abhors political violence. Notice that over 70% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats, they abhor political violence. Well, this is how we should lean into trying to diminish political violence. Specifically, the strategy we've been advocating and getting some traction with political leaders is to have our political leadership redirect anger, not try to become therapists, put people on a couch to talk them out of their anger, but to redirect the anger away from violence and toward voting. That's the key to trying to limit and prevent political violence. And what does that mean? What that means is there's a critical need for especially swing state governors who are a mix of Republican and Democrats to come together and to do it now and essentially prioritize more protection for our election workers. We got over 20,000 here. They're going to be there. And also to make joint video statements together condemning political violence. We do this. This is one real tactic that we all can do, and you as ethnic media can help us achieve the goal of preventing political violence in this already incredibly dangerous election. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. A lot to think about and to write about too. And because we are already almost a quarter hour, I'm going to move on, right? I'm going to move right to the 4 panelists and then questions at the end. Okay. So I'm going to welcome someone who's on the grassroots working in a place that we've all written a lot about, Arizona, in the past few years. I remember as an immigration reporter writing about Arizona a lot over the last 15 years, and we're still there, it appears. So May, please go ahead and do your presentation.
All right, thank you for having me. I'll try to go quick. I have a timer on for 8 minutes, but I just want to give an overview about our organization, Arizona NHPI for Equity, and that's for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. We are the only NHPI organization in Arizona that is focused on increasing civic engagement within our community. Before our founding in 2019, there was no organization that was reaching out to Asian Americans as well as Pacific Islanders to give them information. We strive for our mission by developing young leaders, educating voters on what is on the ballot. And we do that through tabling at community events. We send out mailers. We have digital ads. We do canvassing, knock door to door, as well as phone and text banking. The information that we give is typically in Chinese and Vietnamese, as well as in English, because we found out that those were the 2 languages spoken the most in Arizona from census data. Since we're talking about voting in the elections, I did want to bring up that we are involved with a lawsuit against the state of Arizona, and that is for 2 voter suppression laws that were passed in 2022. One of the laws adds more requirements for providing proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. The other law gives county recorders the right to suspect voters of being a non-citizen and purge voter rolls and purge voters off voter rolls if additional proof of citizenship is not provided. It may also lead to criminal investigations if people do not respond to a 35-day notice for them to give proof of citizenship. These laws impact naturalized citizens who may not be able to provide documentation within the 35 days, and then they'll be kicked off of the voter rolls. Arizona has the most extreme requirements in the country for providing proof of citizenship when registering to vote in state and local elections. They passed this this requirement back in 2004, and just recently they found that registrants who registered before 2004 did not provide citizenship, so that led to 98,000 citizens being taken off the voter roll. While looking at, who was taken off this year, they found that only one person was a non-citizen on the voter roll, and that person has never voted. It is safe to say that the non-citizens voting rhetoric is a scare tactic that certain elected officials and media outlets use to divide our state. And that is why cross-racial collaboration is crucial for our organization to prioritize. Speaking of cross-racial collaboration, another obstacle other than extreme requirements for proving citizenship is felony disenfranchisement, which our organization is working on with our rights restoration program. Arizona is the 4th highest state that incarcerates people and is the 8th highest has the 8th highest incarceration rate in the world. Currently, there are around 235,000 Arizonans that are disenfranchised, and that makes up almost 5% of the voting age population in Arizona. 13% of eligible Black voters have been disenfranchised in Arizona. And then 1 out of 3 disenfranchised voters are Hispanic, making Arizona the 2nd highest disenfranchising state of the Latino population. It is important for NHPIs to address this racial disparity of felony disenfranchisement because our population is still growing in this state, and this is another tactic of voter suppression. Arizona also has one of the least accessible rights restoration processes in the nation, so some of these voters will be disenfranchised and lose their voting rights for the rest of their lives. I do want to talk about something a little lighter, which is our grassroots efforts to get people at the polls. Our strategy is to celebrate ANHPI talents, arts, and culture. We invest in local AAPI talent to spread pride and diversity, since this is a battle of what kind of democracy we want. And we are saying that we want a multiracial, multicultural democracy, and we do so by celebrating all cultures. Another way is, we do send out reminders to BIPOC voters on key election dates and information on how to vote. Something I am worried about for this election year in Arizona is that the anti-immigrant narrative is running rampant, making it easier for lawmakers to pass laws that target immigrant communities. This year, voters are deciding on whether or not state departments can suspect people of being a non-citizen and ask them for proof of citizenship right on the spot. This gives police departments a reason to stop any person who looks like an immigrant and can lead to other charges, which may lead to them losing their voting rights. That is a ballot measure that people will be voting on for this year, which adds to the division and the polarization that voters are really getting tired of. A challenge that we face with expanding civic engagement is, our community, we need to be courageous and brave and overcome the anti-immigrant narrative that's happening in Arizona, especially since we are a border state. We're an extremely polarized culture, and people are hesitant of getting political because they don't want to break their personal relationships. Voter apathy is growing because people are struggling with living costs and inflation. And in Arizona, they feel like the government isn't impacting our issues. And that is because of the political makeup of the legislative chambers. We have majority Republican House and state representatives. And with that, we are constantly in defense on harmful bills rather than coming up with proactive bills that address the issues in Arizona. So thank you. My time just ran up.
Thank you, May. And because we only have 8 minutes left, I'm going to just ask a question for everyone and we'll go around the panel. So, and this is something that we ask when there is a situation like this, where ethnic media has a role that we can play. What do you think we can do as journalists in ethnic media that cover diverse communities to raise awareness of the need for greater security and to mitigate fears of voting? Let's start with Ms. Stewart. She's still around. Yes, yeah, there you are.
Sorry, what's the last part of your question?
What do you think ethnic media can do to raise awareness of the need for greater security and to mitigate fears in this context that we find ourselves?
Yeah, so I think we all play a role in making sure that people know our elections are secure, and particularly for voters who are targeted, underrepresented communities. I think that the ethnic news has a particular role in that. But the other side of that coin is confronting really dangerous messaging. And because, like other panelists have said here, some of the messaging is very dangerous to individuals, and whether that's the immigrant community, religious communities, et cetera, I think that there's an opportunity to push back on that. So hopefully those two things, again, two sides of one coin, but really important.
Thank you, and we really appreciate you being with us today. Okay, Andrew, do you think about that? What do you think we can do?
Sure. One other thing I think is really important as we approach the election is to remind people that the vast majority of voters are going to have positive voting experiences this year. It's important that they be making sure they have a plan to vote because the rules might have changed. And it's important that they understand there are threats like political violence. But the example I like to give involves poll watchers. Unfortunately, in every election, we see some poll watchers who are allowed to be there, who play a good role of transparency in our system, engage in bad behavior. They're over aggressive. They intimidate voters. They disrupt election workers. But the vast majority don't. Most voters either won't notice if there are poll watchers at their polling location, or they'll see them and there'll be no problem at all. That is how most of our elections function. It's really important that we're aware of the outliers and the margins, that we're responding to them. But as we approach the election, I want to make sure, again, the vast majority of people who vote will have good experiences and won't encounter a lot of the issues we're raising.
Good to know. Thank you. Professor Pape?
There's really a couple things that ethnic media can do. And I also want to say I've sent the organizers my slides so you can send them on to everybody who's on this Zoom. There's two things that they can do. Number one is a major campaign to go to your governors. And I think that it's really critical to know politicians respond to their citizens. It matters whether you get 5 people or you get 500,000 people asking for something. And this group across the 7 swing states really could make a major difference in whether we actually are going to respond, and the governors will definitely hear you. The second big thing is, I didn't get a chance to show you, we've done large messaging studies. The message that matters the most to reduce political violence is a very simple message, but it says simply this: all political violence is illegal, immoral, and un-American. All. If you only pick on the other side, if you're Democrat and you only pick on Republican violence or vice versa, it makes it worse. That's why Joe Biden, if you will go to his statements for almost 2 years now, has always said all political violence is illegal, immoral, and un-American. Those are the keys to, and that is the message that in your media you can really bring home.
Thank you so much. May?
I think with the media is, not adding to stereotypes and stigmas, like really finding stories that are outside of what has been fed to us, back in, the past previous decades. I know originally I am from Chicago, and I did see the media playing a role in racism with the Black communities, just always highlighting, crime within the Black community. But now, we're exposed to so many different types of people. We really need to start celebrating and highlighting those who challenge what we think is already normal, or yeah. So like for me personally, I am an Asian American who lost their voting rights. And I am sharing my story to let people know that, Asian Americans, we are not a monolith. We are not just, your A+ students that only care about education. We also go through issues. And people need to be aware that we are more similar than we are different. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I don't know, Sandy, if you want to come on and make a comment. Our director, Sandy Close.
I think the ethnic media's role in covering today's forum, from the valiant efforts being made to promote education through the League of Women Voters, the extraordinary importance of research from the Brennan Institute tracking the kinds of restrictive laws that are being passed, the great advice and information provided by Professor Pape and his center. I wish we were doing advertorials that all said, or ads that all said, all political violence is illegal, immoral, and un-American. And the kind of artistic efforts groups like May's are undertaking to encourage the voters to feel, my Lord, voting used to be fun, used to be an occasion to celebrate each other, and we'd bring our kids to the ballot box. Well, art is also an extraordinarily inspiring way to encourage civic engagement. So that's my final thought. And this was a very helpful and provocative set of speakers on all these points.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and the reporters in this call. And I wish you a happy weekend.